Britain gave the world some of its most electrifying talents, performers so magnetic that entire nations arranged their lives around watching them. Their names felt permanent and unshakable, but the cameras only ever captured half the story. What they missed was far darker. Bottles hidden in dressing rooms, careers dissolving in silence, and legends dismantling the very gifts that made them immortal. These are the stories nobody wanted told. And trust us, number 2 will genuinely unsettle you. Number 10, Keith Moon. Keith Moon never operated at anything below full throttle. As the drummer for The Who, he treated every performance like a declaration of war against mediocrity. To the outside world, he was the ultimate embodiment of rock and roll rebellion, a man who partied hardest and made absolute chaos look like fine art. But strip away the spectacle, and you found a man terrified of his own mind. Silence wasn't restful for him, it was invasive. Stillness didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the floor dropping away. The bottle became the fastest, most reliable way to flood the room with noise even when no one else was there. At first, the industry marketed his instability as entertainment. Promoters got stories, press got copy, crowds got a legend. Everyone benefited from the myth, until the myth became a cage he couldn't escape. Over time, the chaos stopped being charming and started becoming operationally dangerous. Timing slipped. Energy collapsed. The body began presenting evidence that couldn't be joked away. And here's the cruelest part. Even when he tried to pull back, the exit wasn't clean. He sought medical help to manage withdrawal, but the medication proved fatal when taken incorrectly. He slipped away quietly in his sleep, far from the magnificent mayhem that had defined his public image. Keith Moon wasn't only destroyed by excess, he was destroyed by the terror of existing without it. Number 9. Robert Shaw. Robert Shaw moved through the world like a force of nature. On screen, he projected raw physical authority wrapped in genuine intellectual menace. Audiences didn't just admire him, they believed him completely. But behind that granite exterior lived a relentless, self-interrogating mind that never switched off. Shaw was his own harshest critic, consuming with the same fierce intensity he brought to everything, using the glass as a pressure valve for his inner turbulence. The industry romanticized this as artistic authenticity, quietly ignoring how thin the line between control and collapse had become. In one now legendary incident, he attempted a demanding scene while impaired, believing looseness might unlock truth. It produced incoherence and humiliation instead. He returned the next day sober and delivered it perfectly, a glimpse of how close mastery and self-sabotage can sit. Away from cameras, his body aged faster than his years, bearing the strain of relentless internal pressure. He left behind monumental work and an uncomfortable truth. Brilliance can survive a spiral for a while, but it never escapes untouched. Number 8. Tony Hancock. For a generation of viewers, Tony Hancock wasn't just a comedian. He was a mirror. His material captured ordinary frustration with surgical precision, and at his peak, he was the most celebrated entertainer in the country. Yet, the man constructing all that brilliant self-awareness was simultaneously being devoured by it. Hancock was pathologically self-critical. Every triumph convinced him he was one step closer to exposure as a fraud. Alcohol quieted the relentless internal noise until it didn't. Comfort became dependence. Dependence became isolation. And isolation became identity. As his spiral accelerated, he pushed away his closest creative partners, convinced they were the problem. He attempted fresh starts, new settings, geographical reinventions. But the patterns traveled with him everywhere. His story didn't unfold like Scandal. It was quieter, a narrowing of opportunities, an erosion of stability, a man slowly thinning out of his own life. When the end came, it stunned the nation, not because signs were invisible, but because celebrity culture had trained everyone to normalize his deterioration as simply just how he was. Number 7. Wilfrid Brambell. To tens of millions, Wilfrid Brambell was the magnificently repulsive, scheming old wretch of Steptoe and Son. So convincingly grotesque that audiences assumed the performance revealed the man. The reality was a suffocating contradiction. Off-screen, Brambell was immaculate, articulate, and living in perpetual fear. As a gay man navigating an era that had only just decriminalized his existence, exposure wasn't embarrassing. It felt like annihilation. That relentless vigilance was psychologically exhausting. Alcohol became his management strategy. Not celebration, not glamour, just a chemical way to blur the edges of a life lived permanently on guard. Colleagues noticed the unpredictability creeping in, missed lines, unsteady arrivals, moods shifting without warning. The warmth audiences believed was real was a fragile, carefully maintained construction. A notorious television appearance later in his life cracked it open publicly. A man visibly struggling to hold himself together while the cameras rolled. His final years turned inward and quiet. He had generated laughter for millions, yet that laughter provided zero protection against the cost of decades spent chemically managing fear. Number 6. Ian Hendry. Ian Hendry was the golden boy, the man universally expected to become Britain's defining screen presence of his generation. His early success felt less like a breakthrough and more like a coronation. But Hendry carried an appetite that fame simply couldn't satisfy. His unraveling was slow and agonizing rather than dramatic. In an era where heavy indulgence was casually excused as part of the job, enablers looked the other way until the damage was irreversible. While contemporaries escalated into international stardom, Hendry drifted toward smaller roles and slashed budgets. Studios quietly reclassified him from star to liability, not loudly, not cruelly, just efficiently. Personal losses compounded the slide until alcohol stopped being a choice and became the default setting. He died in his early 50s, remembered not as someone forgotten, but as someone the industry filed away with familiar, uncomfortable recognition. Immense promise surrendered slowly, one compromised choice at a time. Number 5. Jack Wilde. Jack Wilde's story is a chilling indictment of the child star machine. As a teenager, he became an international phenomenon, celebrated for a cheeky charm the camera adored. But extraordinary fame arrived years before he possessed the emotional architecture to survive it. Surrounded by adult excess and treated as far older than he was, Wilde quickly learned that alcohol smoothed the jagged edges of performance anxiety and made him feel like he belonged in rooms he hadn't earned yet. Casual indulgence hardened into reliance before he was old enough to understand what adulthood actually demanded. When the boyish charm faded, the industry that had exploited his youth showed zero patience for his struggle. Doors closed, not always loudly, but definitively. He eventually found sobriety, but late and at immense cost. Recovery doesn't always restore what was lost. Sometimes it simply provides clarity about how much is gone. His story remains one of the starkest illustrations of how fame can arrive as a gift and quietly behave like a theft. Number 4. Charles Hawtrey. On screen, Charles Hawtrey was safely eccentric, flustered, socially awkward, and reliably harmless. The actual man behind the oversized spectacles inhabited something considerably darker. As his fame peaked, reliance on alcohol shifted from habit to unyielding necessity. What registered as endearing quirkiness on film became unpredictable hostility off it. When the franchise that made him famous finally cut him loose, he experienced it as public humiliation, a verdict rather than a business decision. Instead of recalibrating, he retreated into bitter isolation, settling into a routine built around resentment and the local pub. His stubbornness became legendary. As his health deteriorated, he refused intervention with a consistency that bordered on deliberate self-punishment, even when doctors offered clear paths to survival. Hawtrey didn't crash spectacularly. He chose his ending in increments, one refusal at a time, constructing a life so narrow it eventually had nowhere left to go. Number 3. Yootha Joyce. Yootha Joyce dominated screens with performances of such effortless authority that audiences believed she was operating comfortably at the summit of her power. In truth, she was executing the ultimate high-functioning illusion. Joyce lived in grinding terror, convinced she was a fraud, perpetually on the verge of exposure. Fame amplified her loneliness rather than relieving it. She delivered razor-sharp performances while privately consuming staggering amounts of vodka to numb her self-doubt. Drinks were disguised, routines managed, appearances maintained with exhausting precision. The world saw competence and assumed health. The world applauded, and she assumed confession would be fatal to everything she'd built. The body, however, kept its own ledger. Subtle signals began surfacing: trembling hands, fatigue that sleep couldn't touch, sadness bleeding through the edges of her performances. Concern was deflected with practiced ease. By the time concealment became impossible, the damage was irreversible. Her health collapsed swiftly, shocking colleagues who had never once seen her miss a beat. Joyce's story is brutal precisely because she didn't look like someone spiraling. She looked like someone winning, right up until there was nothing left to save. Number 2. John Mesurier. We arrive at the most unsettling tragedy on this list because of how incredibly quiet it was. To the public, John Mesurier was the definition of gentle decency. As Sergeant Wilson in Dad's Army, he embodied calm restraint and effortless courtesy, the kind of reassuring presence that made audiences feel the world was fundamentally manageable. But that beloved gentleness masked a man who found confrontation unbearable and emotional pain impossible to face directly. Rather than fight back against the humiliations in his personal life, he retreated. Not with drama, not with rage, with quiet, polite disappearance. He drifted night after night into heavy consumption, using it to sand down the edges of a world that consistently hurt him. He reportedly described himself with devastating understatement as a vague drunk, not a brawler, not a spectacle, just a man softly erasing himself one evening at a time. This is precisely why it's unsettling. His spiral didn't violate anyone's expectations. It didn't produce scandal. It didn't disrupt the public's comfort. There were no tabloid implosions, no dramatic falls from grace. He simply became less present in his own life, slowly, courteously, almost invisibly. Colleagues noticed the physical changes arriving like weather: yellowing skin, thinning frame, energy draining in gradual increments. Yet his manners held throughout. Even as his health collapsed, he continued apologizing, often for things entirely beyond his fault, as though existing itself was an inconvenience he felt obligated to compensate others for. His final words were reportedly gentle, even grateful, as if he remained, to the very last, reluctant to cause anyone the trouble of his departure. That's the chilling truth of Mesurier's spiral. He dismantled himself with such flawless manners that the world barely registered he was vanishing. He didn't crash. He faded. And sometimes fading is the most devastating form of loss, because it's precisely the kind everyone finds easiest to ignore. Number 1. Richard Burton. Richard Burton was less an actor and more a geological force. His voice, classically trained and intellectually formidable, made language sound simultaneously dangerous and beautiful. Fame followed naturally. Wealth followed excessively. Admiration arrived like a tide that never retreated. Yet none of it brought him peace, because Burton was acutely, almost painfully, aware of the magnitude of his own gifts, and that awareness became his prison. He despised compromise, yet repeatedly accepted roles he believed were beneath him, each decision deepening a gnawing private sense of self-betrayal. He didn't drink for pleasure or celebration. He drank to anesthetize the crushing weight of being Richard Burton, to silence the mind that never stopped measuring him against his own impossible myth. Over time, the damage became impossible to ignore. Physical decline that costuming couldn't disguise. Memory lapses that grew alarming. He later admitted there were entire films he couldn't recall making at all, whole chapters of his own career erased. Public appearances revealed a man prematurely aged, his once commanding presence replaced by fragility that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. Those closest to him watched in helpless grief as brilliance persisted, even while the infrastructure beneath it continued crumbling. Attempts to slow down arrived, but not soon enough. The toll had already been extracted beyond recovery. Burton's tragedy isn't that he lacked greatness. He possessed it in quantities most people cannot comprehend. His tragedy is that he felt completely imprisoned by it. In trying to silence the crushing weight of his own genius, he surrendered to the one force patient and powerful enough to dismantle him entirely. 10 giants, 10 private battles, 10 reminders that the most dazzling lights frequently burn at a cost the audience never sees. These weren't cautionary tales in the making. They were tragedies hiding in plain sight, dressed in brilliance and wrapped in public admiration. If this changed how you see these icons, share the video. Some conversations are long overdue.